I remember after 9/11 walking into a village in northern Kenya, and the women came up to me and they were like, "We heard something happened in your country, but we don't know what it is. And can you tell us?" Because the men won't tell us what happened. Women just lacked access to information. Men controlled access even to radios at that time. And so that was this moment where I realized just how stark that control and power and lack of power was for women.
Hey everyone, it's Hildy, and this is the Creating the Future podcast. I'm glad you've joined us here today. This is the place for us to explore what really creates social change, what will actually create the healthy, joyful future we all want to live in. That question is at the heart of Creating the Future's mission. For over a decade, Creating the Future has been applying the question-based framework of catalytic thinking to demonstration projects around the world, talking with folks about the factors that lead to social change. Our end goal is simple: help social justice efforts achieve more transformational change, all by changing the questions they ask. That is why I'm so happy that Renee Wittemyer is joining us on the podcast today. Renee is the Vice President for Program Strategy at Pivotal, a group of organizations founded by Melinda French Gates, whose goal is to accelerate social progress for women and young people in the U.S. and around the world. Renee's social justice journey began in East Africa, doing elephant research in Kenya, a story I'm excited for her to share. From there, prior to her work at Pivotal, Renee spent years directing strategic initiatives at the tech giant Intel, all while advocating for gender equity in the male-dominated world of technology. Given the breadth of her experience in so many aspects of the social justice ecosystem, it is my joy to welcome Renee Wittemyer to the podcast today. Welcome, Renee, to the podcast. I am so glad we've finally been able to pull this together. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I am excited as well. Could you start out by just sharing a little bit about your journey? What is it that led you to get into working in social justice?
Yeah, so I can take a step back and just say, right now I work for Pivotal, which is a group of organizations that was founded by Melinda French Gates, and I am the VP of Program Strategy. So I feel like I have the coolest job. And in my journey, it was not linear, but it brought me to Pivotal and to work and partner with Melinda, and it's been amazing. I would say the kind of early days, I worked in East Africa actually for several years. I'm a social scientist. And so after college, I worked in northern Kenya. I started an elephant research camp with my now husband, and we were both students at the time and had fellowships. And he was studying elephants, and I was working with the communities surrounding a national park up in northern Kenya. And so I have just worked with women's groups, schools, education groups, really I was working on a community conservation program there. And that was kind of the beginning of really my interest. It eventually led me to get a PhD and a policy degree as well, but really was the spark about listening to people's voices on the ground and how that is so important for me as I think about change in the world.
We've talked a little bit about the fact that so much of Creating the Future's work is rooted in radical inclusion, that listening, being with the people on the ground, so important. Did your childhood lead you to do this work?
No, I grew up in New Jersey. I'd never been to Africa before. But my parents are immigrants from India. And so I had spent kind of every 2 years of my life going to India to visit family and relatives, and would always think about the stark disparities between my life in New Jersey and a lot of the poverty that I would see in different parts of India. And that always stuck with me. And my family has always kind of, even back to my, great grandparents, have always kind of focused on helping communities. And so it's kind of my upbringing as well.
It's in the blood. It's
It
in
is
the,
important. Yes.
yep, absolutely, absolutely. In all that you have experienced, what have you learned that actually creates change? When you've seen change happen, what are some of the factors that you see that actually lead to real change happening? We're so used to incremental change, but what do you see happening when pretty dramatic change is happening?
I would say a couple things. And so in my role at Pivotal, I really get to see how philanthropy can play this important role in driving progress. And I bring together all of my life experiences. So that piece around listening to people with lived experiences, listening to experts. I love data. I love kind of ethnographic research, really hearing people's stories about whatever the problem is. And then also thinking about, how do you think about change both in the short term and the long term? And philanthropy is uniquely positioned to be able to take risks and operate on a longer term horizon than other entities can, whether it's governments or the private sector. And so that, I think, is critical, is really being able to partner with the people who are most impacted, partner with people with lived experiences as well as experts, but also look at the time horizon that you're trying to drive change within. And I would say that, philanthropy is not a silver bullet for change by any means. It cannot fill all the voids that, policy decisions can have. But I do think another key part of driving transformational change is partnership. One group alone cannot do these things. And so, this idea of collective investment in programs from philanthropy, from governments, from civil society, and also that partnership on the ground of local people, whether they're beneficiaries, whether they're crafting the vision, that partnership is key.
When you talk about philanthropy, are you talking about the funding side of philanthropy as we traditionally think about philanthropists, or are you thinking about philanthropy in a broader sense in terms of the entire nonprofit ecosystem?
I'm thinking about it as from a funder's perspective because that's what we
Gotcha.
do. And so at Pivotal, we are really focused on expanding women's power and influence specifically.
Mhm.
And it's really focused on, how do we position women, especially women of color, to make decisions, control resources, and shape policies and perspectives. And we do that with a philanthropic approach. But we also, what I love about Pivotal is that we also have various levers that we use at Pivotal. So it includes high impact investments, philanthropy, partnerships, as I mentioned, as well as advocacy. And it's really about getting more power in the hands of people, especially women in the US and also globally.
Why women?
So I'll say that the focus of Pivotal really roots in the convictions of Melinda French Gates, and her life's work has really been about accelerating the pace of change and social progress for women around the world. And what we have seen is that there's a lack of representation of women in positions of power, whether that's in political office, whether that's in tech, whether that's investment. And that diverse voices, not just, put women at the table, but the diversity of voices create better outcomes, whether that's innovation, whether that's products. I come actually from the tech industry as well. So I had my early days spent on the ground in grassroots settings with villages, with women's groups. And over time, I started doing that research. I was looking at economic development from kind of as a core across all of my research, but I also, when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at the intersection of technologies and how do you support and address poverty. And so at that time, I don't want to date myself, but it was kind of a while ago. But people were thinking about, how can like the ubiquitousness of mobile phones, how can that be used to address some of the poverty issues? How can women get more access to the internet and the benefits that that brings? And there's this massive digital divide and specifically a gender divide. And so through that work, I worked in places like tech companies with social scientists and researchers, but also computer scientists to really say,
Were these tech companies around poverty issues? I mean, or what kinds of tech companies?
Yeah,
Got
so
my
it's funny.
curiosity.
I know it's like not who you would suspect would be thinking about poverty. But when I was doing my research, the only other people who were interested in the questions that I was looking at were the tech companies for different reasons. But they saw these as massive market opportunities. And if you could create value for even the kind of at that time that was called like kind of the bottom of the pyramid consumers, you could unlock something and that value could also help bring people up. And so that was this kind of intersection of so many issues. I always came from it as really thinking about how do you advance populations like women who have the least access to information, to technologies, and are not represented in those companies as equally as men. And so they are not at the table. They are not making the decisions and they're not driving the product. And so I left the tech world to join Pivotal. So it was just when Melinda had just stood up Pivotal back in she established Pivotal in 2015. And I had been in tech. I did all this research around what people really think about technologies and the use in their lives, but also because of my policy background, started driving all these initiatives around getting more women in tech. And at that time, when Melinda set up Pivotal, one of her first strategies was a women in tech strategy to really increase the representation of women driving and leading innovation. And so that's when I joined Pivotal. And I led that strategy for several years. And then I grew my role to oversee all of the innovation strategies at Pivotal. And then about 3 years ago, I took over the program strategy role as VP. And so I've been overseeing all of the programmatic strategies at Pivotal.
So I'm curious what you learned, what stories you heard. Why women in tech? I have my assumptions, but I'm curious when you talk about all of the study that you've done in terms of the intersection of technology and poverty and women. Why women in tech?
So I'll start from the grassroots and then I'll kind of move to the industry. But I remember being in my 20s, walking into villages, and women just lacked access to information. Like simple that, men controlled access even to radios at that time. And I remember basically after 9/11 walking into a village the next day in northern Kenya, and the women who I'd established a relationship and really had a trusted relationship at the time came up to me and they were like, "We heard something happened in your country, but we don't know what it is. And can you tell us? Because the men won't tell us what happened." And so that was this moment where I realized just how stark that control and power and lack of power was for women, particularly around information, which is linked to technologies. So that's like one story. I would say then, like, fast forward to when I was working in the tech industry, I led an internal study at one of the tech companies I worked at, looking at women and people of color and the challenges around advancement and retention in the workplace. And there were kind of building from that asymmetry of power that was happening in these villages. I was seeing that in the workplace. And I led lots of interviews with women, with people of color, and just heard their stories of being told like, hey, you're the diversity hire on the team. Because you're oftentimes, especially in tech, you were the only woman in the room. All the things you know. of like not being listened to, not being heard, or really being unclear about why you weren't progressing. Like, why was this one person who's your manager doing their assessments different than your actual performance on teams? But other people were progressing compared to you. And so it just like that too opened up this deep curiosity and also wanting to learn more about the challenges of the workplace for women. And that is something that at Pivotal, we are also working on. So as I mentioned, like we're working on advancing women's power and influence. One of the key places to do that is in the workplace. And where we see a lot of barriers and challenges, we did a study on really trying to understand what were some of the barriers holding back women's power and influence in the US. And we saw that the workplace specifically was a challenge, and very like kind of layered onto that was the issue of caregiving. And so in the workplace, we saw that men and women enter the workplace with the same levels of ambition. And then as there's that first step from up to kind of a manager role, you saw this broken rung on the ladder and women not progressing equally and much less than men. And so we dug into that and we saw that, lack of flexibility at work, often caregiving responsibilities increase at that time in your life.
Right.
And we know from our work at Pivotal that women disproportionately bear and shoulder the caregiving responsibilities, both for kids and childcare, but also for aging adults. And I do think that our work in the caregiving space is this beautiful example of how Pivotal works and operates, and also how philanthropy can lead to systemic change.
I would love to know. Tell me.
So early on, in the early days of Pivotal, we saw caregiving as this significant barrier to women's economic power, to agency, to choice. And when we were first working on this topic, caregiving wasn't the term anyone was calling it. We were like, what should we call this thing? Is it unpaid work? Is it, we were trying to name it. And it was not caregiving wasn't a common term. And so, but over time, we helped label some of these things. We saw that there are challenges for women around this care issue. And also that the solutions are both in the policy space as well as in the market innovation space. We live in a space where we have the same caregiving kind of infrastructure that's been the same since like the 1950s. The school days ends at a time when no one's home, all of these things. And so we were thinking about, look, how can we help build this modern caregiving system so that families can actually afford them? Because not only is that system outdated and not innovated upon, but it is so unaffordable for most Americans. And we've seen the data on that. Whatever your political perspective is, they want affordable caregiving solutions. And so our goal was to really think about how do families and caregivers have care. And so it's not this burden, that it becomes this source of joy and of comfort. And what we thought about a lot, and when we think about any issue, is what is the role of philanthropy? And for us, we were thinking about how can we unlock new revenue flows for the care system so that there can be more caregiving innovations that can make caregiving more affordable to families. So back in 2016, we were doing research, we were investigating. We did have a body of work in the policy space around paid leave, which we knew was an unlock for both men and women.
Oh, yeah.
Melinda committed $1 billion to her agenda around women's power and influence back in 2019. And caregiving was this like core component of that strategy. And then we also were looking at the investment space. So there were people talking about these issues, but they weren't all aligned around what they're called. And so we started thinking about and doing research to assess how big is this market opportunity? And this is actually a care economy. And what I loved was we started seeing founders putting this data and these terms and using them in their pitch decks. And as they were going out for investments, and we see it's a vibrant market opportunity. There are a lot of people who are innovating in that space, as well as investors who are interested in it. So it was kind of this arc of how we saw this become more salient. COVID was, I think, a big inflection point too, when everyone was like, got it, caregiving, it impacts all of us on a day-to-day
Right.
basis. It is so visible. And our partners that we support from a philanthropic perspective really used that moment to drive the narrative, but also to show what types of solutions there are. And I do think that employers too started seeing like, this is actually something our employees need. And if we want to keep our employees, we need to provide caregiving benefits.
It was so interesting. You're bringing up for me, and then I've got a question for you, but you're bringing up for me something I experienced 20, 30 years ago. My then partner and I, and now husband and I, started the first diaper bank in the country years ago. And we started having these conversations with people in our communities, leaders in our local community here. We called it the poverty game. And what we did was we handed them cards. We told them what the situation was. The parents have two small kids. Mom is studying to be a nurse. Dad is working in a machine shop. We made them just regular people, and that they were barely getting by. And then we handed them a card and we said, pick a card. One of them was, your kid is sick. What do you do? One of them is, your car breaks down. And what was so interesting to me, and I carry this, it's got to be 30 years later, is one of the biggest real estate moguls in our community, who also had a foundation, was very philanthropic. She turned to me at the end and she said, I had no idea, when my receptionist just has to leave in the middle of the day, I just get pissed off. She said, I had no idea what life they were living. And that's really what you're reminding me of, is the disparity between employers not getting it, that this is such a vital thing for their success as an employer. And
Yeah,
that's always stuck with me.
I love that. And also the power of the stories that
Oh,
you had. And I just think, as actually when we first started working on the caregiving issue, just to understand, we supported a big research study on gathering ethnographic research and really understanding the stories of American
explain
families.
ethnographic research to our listeners.
Ethnographic research is when it's a kind of approach in social sciences to listen and absorb stories. It can be participatory, where you are sitting and living with a family, spending days shadowing them and just understanding their lives. It's not just going and doing a survey or going and doing an interview, it's much more immersive. And so we supported these researchers to go spend time in these families across the US and really identify what are some of the stories and challenges that they face. And those are the things that are, as you were saying, like so powerful to catalyze change. I really do think that narrative piece is also a really important lever for driving change.
Well, the narrative is nothing if nobody's listening. So those really go together. I'm really curious how listening and narrative affects your strategic decisions.
I think those are core as we're developing new strategies. And so as we are looking, we are data people. Melinda is a data person, and we really value those stories and, as I was saying, lived experiences. And so as we're developing new strategies, so we recently have been working in the space of women's health. And that's kind of a new area for Pivotal. It is an old area for Melinda. She has worked in the space of women's health her whole career. But for us, as we are really thinking about what do we want to do in this space, we do exactly that. We take the quantitative, we take the qualitative data, and really the stories to inform what we want to do.
Where do you get the stories from?
The stories come from research that we either commission or we read or we look for. We also are really in the early days of thinking more about how can we unlock narrative. It's been a tool in a lot of our strategies, but is there more we can do there? And we're actively thinking about that work too, because it is so powerful and it resonates with people. So like sometimes like the numbers resonate, the data, I'm kind of a data nerd, but like that doesn't always resonate. But like the richness of people's experiences do resonate.
So much of Creating the Future's work, catalytic thinking, is rooted in brain science. We are wired for stories. One of the interesting things about brain science that I found fascinating is that when we hear stories, our brains, when they do functional MRIs, when they do fMRIs, and they watch what areas of the brain lights up, the brain lights up in the exact same way if we were experiencing it as hearing those stories. So we are wired for that.
I often think about my own story and experience as someone who has worked in the tech workplace and how that has kind of grown as I work at Pivotal. So you were saying that person who was annoyed that their person leaves in the middle of the day. When I was in tech, and especially you're surrounded by men.
Right.
And also there's all the dynamics that go with that. I would never tell anyone anything about like what I had to do. But meanwhile, in my head, I'm like, okay, I have to pick up that kid at this time. My nanny is sick, or I don't have childcare today. All those things.
Yep.
And the stark difference right now, and what I love and value about Pivotal, is being able to be yourself at work.
Mm-hmm.
When I remembered my first meeting at Pivotal, I was like, wow, there's a lot of women here. And I don't think I'd ever been in a conference room with that many women. But we just have an incredibly diverse and supportive group of people who I get to work with and partner with every day, who are so smart, just don't take themselves seriously, but just extremely thoughtful. And it creates a workplace environment where you can be yourself and feel supported. And that, I do think, is another unlock for employers, is really thinking about how can you create supportive spaces that people can acknowledge that they have caregiving issues and it's okay.
Yeah. We're humans. We're people first. We're workers, maybe fourth, fifth. Obviously, capitalism sees us as workers first, and as humans doesn't really matter. But as humans, we're feeling creatures. That you mentioned, feeling supported. So much of what is important, whether it's in a workplace or in a social change environment or wherever, is how do we feel about it?
Absolutely. I do think that one of the things that I found in that study when I was around the workplace in tech was people feeling that their managers hold so much power over their day-to-day happiness. And what we found in our kind of survey results was they didn't really care about some of the issues that were coming up for the participants that we were interviewing. And so that disparity creates this space where you don't feel supported. And so one of the things that we did, which was to the credit in tech, was here are these opportunities to support managers so that they understand what's going on and so that they can show up as supportive. And I really was impressed when I was asked to do the study and the receptivity around the recommendations that came out of it.
I really appreciate the focus on the workplace. We spend most of our lives in the workplace. And half the time we're not in the workplace, we're thinking about the workplace. But I'm also finding it interesting, going back to your work in Kenya, that the workplace is where people are working. So women do so much of the work, and again, unacknowledged, uncompensated. But there's that through line that it doesn't really matter. And is that work appreciated? Is the work of caregiving appreciated? One of my guests last year was Rianne Eisler, who has spent her life looking at the disparity of caring economies, caring places of being, and the fact that it is consistently not valued. But if we don't have it, we have nothing.
One of the things I'd love to just share with you is, around the workplace and what Pivotal is doing. So we see that as a space to really unlock power and influence for women. And as part of a big commitment that Melinda made now 2 years ago, we announced a $60 million partnership with the Aspen Institute and something that we're calling the Workplace Innovation Now Challenge, which really is about discovering, unlocking new ideas to remove barriers that women face, finding innovations in that space. And so we have an open call right now that is looking for ideas to seed and scale. And there's an opportunity there to really, there's some amazing researchers that we see all throughout the US who have done work on the workplace and they know what works. Iris Bonet at Harvard is one example. She has this incredible evidence-based solutions for some of these challenges, but oftentimes the research isn't applied in the workplace. And so part of this challenge is to say, how can some of the existing evidence-based research be applied to unlocking solutions for women? How can AI be a tool in this? It's rapidly changing the workplace. We don't know how it's going to go over the next several years, but how can we unlock AI as a way to also advance women's power and influence? So that's also part of this partnership with Aspen. So we're really excited about it. There's just such great ideas coming in.
Well, and the AI disparities is a whole nother place of looking at both people of color and women. The fact that AI is being programmed by the current paradigm, which is racist and misogynist.
Yeah, Melinda was a computer scientist, so she cares about women in tech.
Right.
And women have been historically, the numbers that went down after she graduated with her computing degree. And what we've seen actually in terms of progress has been, since we've worked in the space around women in tech specifically, and when I joined back in 2017, this increase in almost doubling the number of women graduating with computing degrees, in part to many of our partners who are just incredible and doing incredible work there. But what we saw was also that in AI, women are even more underrepresented and do not have positions of power. Their voices aren't the ones that are being called on in all the articles that you see in the news. There's just so many opportunities around that. And so that's a space that we're actively thinking about. What next? What do we do in that space as well?
I'm curious, Renee. I have my assumptions. I know some of my own stories. I'm curious, why focus on women? To what end? What happens when there are more women in tech? What happens when there are more women climbing that ladder? What is different when there are more women involved?
Well, so we know that when there's more diverse perspectives at the table, generally there's a huge amount of research on that. It unlocks innovation, it unlocks new types of products, it unlocks different kinds of leadership. And so for us, we want to see in political power, we want to see women at those tables because it brings different perspectives. And that diversity of perspectives represents and reflects a broader set of views that have actual impacts on outcomes, whether that's on policies, whether that's on market innovation. That list goes on and on. And then we also know, let's go back to, Kenya. If you invest in women, they're going to invest in their community. They're not only investing in themselves. That funding, if they're taking microfinance, loans, they are investing back in their kids' education, their communities, and lifting everybody up. So there's just these broad ripple effects if you really focus on a particular population like women, because it really brings up all boats.
Awesome. I wish we had another 2 hours to keep talking about this stuff. We will definitely have to continue this conversation. I would love to know, as you have been experiencing, learning along the way with everything that you have seen, if you had one thing that you could share with our listeners that you wish they could do to sort of step into their own power, what would that be? Something practical that they can do.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot when I was younger. I wasn't working at a big philanthropy, but it was, how do I make change that is local? And I also talk about this a lot with my kids, because sometimes it just feels like driving transformational change is this big lofty goal that you're changing the, percent of women graduating with computing degrees. And I think such powerful change happens locally in your own community, and that we all have so much agency to do it. And oftentimes it's stepping into your power to drive that change in whatever way is meaningful to you, whether that is with your food bank, whether that's with starting a project in your community because you see a gap or you hear something that is missing. I just think we all have so much power, and it's about stepping into it and taking that step to be brave, to do something.
We have a lot more influence locally. We're so used to thinking nationally and globally. I can't fix the whole problems of the whole world, but I live on a street. We have much more influence locally and in state governments, local governments. One of the things that we've recently experienced here in Tucson is we were, if not the first community, one of the first communities to say no to a data center. Data centers take up a ton of water, and we live in the desert. And what has been interesting to watch, to your point, is the ripple. One community says no, and another community says, oh my gosh, that's possible. And what we're watching now is state legislations and community legislations looking at national legislations about the placement of AI data centers. It is always amazing to me. I love the recommendation that just step into something locally, because that's where we do have power.
Absolutely.
Renee, thank you so much for being with us today. And I do hope that we'll continue this conversation another time, because I would love to hear more, and I'm sure our listeners will. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's so delightful to be with you.
I'm so grateful to Renee for sharing her observations and experience with us. Given Creating the Future's focus on radical inclusion and radical possibility, you can feel that sense of possibility and inclusion and joy as Renee talks about the work Pivotal is doing. Whether it is influencing policy or influencing the tech industry, Pivotal is taking on what others might think of as impossible hurdles. And so it is inspiring to hear the big, hairy, audacious efforts that Pivotal is taking on. I especially appreciate Renee's emphasis on the importance of listening to folks in communities. I was reminded throughout our conversation of the power of that very first question of catalytic thinking. Who will be affected by whatever we're considering, and what would it take for them to be part of the decision and lead the direction we take? Renee speaks so much about the power of listening to people's stories and the power of people simply being given the opportunity to tell their stories. I love the phrase she uses, listening for the richness of people's experiences. That is the difference between charity work and true social justice work. You can learn more about Renee's work at the podcast page for this episode. And if this episode got you thinking, we hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and colleagues and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious about the work we're doing at Creating the Future, we encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. Every week we share practice exercises to help you put a toe in to shift the power of your own work simply by changing the questions you ask. You can find that newsletter and a ton of other resources at creatingthefuture.org. Thank you for being with us today and for wanting to create a better future for our world. We'll see you next time here at Creating the Future.